There's a sense of unhappiness, firstly, right? So we're either unhappy or unfulfilled in some capacity. You can feel it in your body. You're having those conversations in your head or with other people. But when it starts to get to that place where it's like you're having that conversation more than you think you probably even should, then that's a clear indication it's time to make a change. Originally I wanted to be a doctor and I wanted to help people. That was my original intention. And so I figured this was a first good step. But when I got in there, I realized that this is a business. I could still kind of pretend that I was helping people, but I knew there was this calling inside of me that was saying this is not the right place to be. Always believe in yourself, because the self-belief in ourselves is what propels us to the next level. Here's the thing, as you go through changes in life, there are always going to be people who are going to be happy for you and people who are not going to be happy for you. And if we listen to the people who are not going to be happy for us, and unfortunately some of that is going to be your friends that you have today, because if you don't believe in yourself, the masses will pull you down and they'll pull you back. And they're not intentionally trying to do that, but what they are doing is they're pulling you down because they're such in a fear state that they don't want you to leave that fear state, because if you leave that fear state, then they've got to really look at themselves, and they don't want to do that most of the time.
Welcome back to the 5 Minute Career Hack Podcast. I'm so excited that you're joining us again today for an incredible interview with none other than Doug Brown, my cousin from another mother, right? So let's jump right into it. Doug, you've experienced both corporate world and the entrepreneurial world. What are some of the key signs that a high-performing professional might be outgrowing their current role or career path in your experience?
Well, there's a sense of unhappiness, firstly, right? So we're either unhappy or unfulfilled in some capacity, and you can feel it in your body. You're having those conversations in your head or with other people, and it's really the universe kind of tapping on you about things you've been thinking about all the way along, anyways. But when it starts to get to that place where it's like you're having that conversation more than you think you probably even should, then that's a clear indication it's time to make a change.
Now, I'm specifically I asked the questions for, most of the audience, they're high performers, they're mid-level managers to executives. We're talking to you today. Now, that's not to say that if you're kind of just middle of the road that you wouldn't be experiencing that as well. But you've done so much in your career, Doug, that I think you were the perfect person to have this conversation with. And you mentioned just now in that first answer was that there's something that's going to be kind of gnawing at you, right? Underneath the surface, something that you can't get off your mind. Do you personally have some experience with that you can share of what that could look like, or clients that you've supported and helped?
Oh yeah, I mean, I've got dozens of examples where one of the most prominent ones I think was I went to school, for example, and I got degrees in biology, nuclear medicine. I also have business degrees and music degrees, but I was working in the hospital with nuclear medicine, and I dreaded going in there every day. And the reason I got into healthcare was, originally I wanted to be a doctor and I wanted to help people. That was my original intention. And so I figured this was a first good step. But when I got in there, I realized that this is a business and it's treated very heavily like a business first, especially in our American healthcare system versus healthcare. And, I could still kind of pretend that I was helping people, but I knew there was this calling inside of me that was saying, this is not the right place to be. And so, can you imagine after going through almost 10 years of schooling that you go, okay, this is not the right place for me when you have student loans and all these other things that come along with it? But this whisper started, and when I reflect back on it, it started even before I started the nuclear medicine program. But I just ignored it. And when I got into the hospital, it was very, very clear. And then I had been selling music equipment through this whole process. One of the best jobs I ever had in my life. I was selling music equipment to a lot of the bands that we listen to on the radio, even still today. And well, many now are in the oldies because I'm an older guy, right? But what happened was I was walking down the hallway one time and the hospital was on high alert because the government was coming in, the regulatory industry, to inspect the hospital. And everybody was so fearful. And I was like, I don't want to live this way. When I was selling music equipment and it hit me, I was like, oh my gosh, I made 3 times as much money selling music equipment than I was in the hospital. And I didn't have any of this fear and this trepidation, and I didn't have all these people always worried and all this stress and all this stuff. And this inner voice inside me kept saying, "Get out. It's time to move." Right. And then serendipity, I guess, or whatever we want to call it, universal fate. I watched a YouTube video where Steve Jobs from Apple was talking about if you're having bad days more than a few days in a row, it's time to rethink your direction. And it was the University of Stanford speech video that he did. People can watch it today. And so I made the decision, I'm leaving. And I didn't know what I was leaving for, but then a few days later, a friend of mine came up and said, "Hey, I've got this telecommunications opportunity and you know how to sell. Why don't you try this?" And I did. And I left the hospital, went into the sales arena in the corporate sales, and then I 6x'd my earnings from where I was in the hospital in my first year.
So what I heard you say there, first there was this gnawing even before school, right? Around
Mhm.
what you should be
Yeah,
doing. Then second, you were in the experience and you didn't like physiologically, not just mentally, but physiologically, you didn't like how it felt, which I think is so important to pay attention to those physiological signs that are oftentimes triggered inside of your environment, right? And we don't think about those oftentimes in the workplace like we would in a personal relationship, right? And
correct.
then the third thing you said was that as you were having these thoughts, these feelings, something it dropped right in your lap. The Steve Jobs Stanford video, right? Dropped in your lap, and automatically you knew at that moment it was time to do something different, even though you didn't have a plan. Now, I'm not saying if you're listening that you should just jump and not have a plan, but sometimes it's going to hit you like that. And it hit me like in a very similar way. But I'm not saying you should absolutely, if you can make a plan, great. But if you have to go, you have to go. Sometimes your life depends on it.
Well, and the thing is it's a bad relationship you're in, right? And so we all can recognize if we've been in a bad relationship on an interpersonal level, and we've stayed too long, we look back on that and go, why did I put up with that? Why did I deal with that? But when it comes to something, you know, like money, uh, people sometimes fear because it's like, well, if I make this move and this doesn't work out, then you know. For me, I think it was a little bit easier because I've always had the ability. I was always working on my own for the most part, and so I always had the ability to know that because I can sell, because I'm a performer in sales, I can go get a job and do anything, right? Because I can sell anything. So it was a little easier. But if you're locked into like an engineering world and you want to move, where do you go, right? So that fear kicks in. But here's what I want people to understand: the longer you stay in this, and I'm not saying today you make the move just like you advise not to, I would too, but make a plan at least. In 6 months, I'm going to be here. In a year, I'm going to be here. And then start action on that plan right now. Because otherwise, what will happen without making that plan, it's like being in a really bad relationship. You will look back on it and go, man, I should have got out of that years ago. And, then when you get out of it, it opens up other opportunities. It's as if we pour water into a cup and then we just keep filling it up with water that is rusty and no good for us to drink, but we keep filling it up. And we were like, man, we're thirsty. I can't drink out of this one because it tastes terrible and I'm going to get sick. There's no difference in the analogy between that and what we're doing. So, pour the water out and, in some capacity. Now, you might go plan to pour the water out later on and get a new cup right now, and start that part time, but get the momentum moving in the positive direction you want to go. Because, you all think you have tomorrow or even this afternoon. But I know plenty of friends when I was in the military that didn't live till tomorrow. And
Mm,
so, it's one of those situations that We're here to enjoy our lives. That is the purpose, part in purpose, to help ourselves and express ourselves. And if we consistently or one time hold ourselves in a position where we're not moving off that space, then there's no one else to blame when it really comes down to it. It will be our decision, and we have full right to make that decision. And nothing's going to happen like, tr- you might go through a little up and down on it, but in the short run, it'll all work out if you stay focused and keep going on that direction.
Yeah, that's so good. There was something that you said that I want to make sure I underscore, highlight, stop, pause, write it down if you're listening, watching, is that you had the confidence to make the move without a necessarily a quote unquote plan because you had
Right.
options, right? You knew you were confident in your ability to sell anything, and you had evidence of that in your past experience that let you know, hey, I've got options even though I don't have an exact plan. So inevitably, you had a plan because you had a skill set that you knew you
Right.
could monetize, which is incredible. So and then you mentioned the fact that, hey, if you're not ready to jump, at least start with a plan. Part of that plan could just be creating the option, but chances are you already have it on the table. You've just got to amplify it so that you can see it for what it actually is. Would you agree with that statement?
I'd agree fully. And I've also had in my life, my father, for example, had done something like this. My dad was a super smart guy. He worked for Raytheon, and they asked him to go open a new plant in France. And he was in Massachusetts at the time.
Mm,
Well, he had a family, I was just coming along. So he had I had three older brothers. And my dad went into Raytheon one day and said, I quit. And he then went and started his own business as a electric machinery repair company, industrial equipment repair. And he went to my grandfather, and my grandfather, old school through the Depression, said to my father, "You've ruined your life. You had a stable career. You had everything you wanted, and you have a family. And what are you going to do with your life?" The conversation that a lot of parents have with their children. And my dad said, "Well, I'm going to follow my instinct." And so he opened this place called Henry Brown, H. Brown, industrial electric motor repair, right? And he started working. And 2 days later, my grandfather, who worked for Toll Silversmith for 30 years, got laid off. And he went to my father and said, I got laid off. My dad said, "Well, Dad, why don't you be part of the business? Because you're a machinist, you know how to use equipment, got a lot of skills I don't." And in 1962, I was born, and that's when this company started. Um, they were in business 18 years together, and fed the families, and were able to sell the business assets off, and essentially retire from that decision. And so I've had so many mentors in my life like that, where they just left a position and went on to start their own thing, and it turns out to be, Deloitte, or it turns out to be some other company that we've heard of. And so there's always these up and downs. I think the biggest challenge, though, is that people are fearful. It's like they get into the scarcity mode because they have a salary, and that salary or an hourly wage, it's like it's paying the bills. But here's the thing I want people to understand: you can keep that stability. You don't have to do what my dad did or what I did. You can keep that stability, build upon something. I did that in one other company that I was working for. Actually, that telecommunications company I went to work for, after 2.5 years, I was like, it's time for me to move on. So I started my own telecommunications consulting and auditing company. And I got that company up to a place where it would just barely pay the bills. And then I left. I started to leave the multi six figure job. And then the CEO comes along and says, "Listen, why don't you stay here? We'll give you $450,000 base salary and upside commission." So this is pretty high at that time in life. And it was like, I just can't. And so I left that job. And here's the reason I want people to understand this. When I left that telecommunications job and started my own telecommunications company, I ended up consulting and helping out companies that were in the training space. One of them was called Coach University. And that led me on to meet J. Conrad Levinson, who wrote a series of books called Guerrilla Marketing, who introduced me to a guy named Chet Holmes. Well, I ended up helping Chet in his company, and eventually I became president of training and sales as an independent for that. And then Tony Robbins comes along and buys into the company. So now for 7 years, I'm Tony Robbins, president of training and sales, which has led me on to work with Deepak Chopra, Brian Tracy, E-Myth, Russ Whitney, who owned Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and a bunch of huge brands that if I hadn't made that decision to make that move, I would have taken that $450,000 position. Now, I still would have done okay. But internally, I would have been dying. And this is what I asked my dad. I said, Dad, why did you leave that? He said, Doug, I went in one day and some guy burst his stomach open from an ulcer. And he said, spit blood all over the floor. And I decided I'm not going to be that guy for you guys. And
Mm.
so, you know, who knows if he had taken the position, I would have probably grown up in France, right? So the point being, you don't know where it's going to lead, but internally, we all have a clock that's telling us go this way. Don't go that way. We've all had the experience where you walk into a room and it's like something doesn't feel right, right? Well, that's your internal being saying, step back. you know, we've all had that moment where we were like, well, should I do this or not do this? And inside, something's screaming, yes, or something's screaming, hell no, don't do that, right? Pay attention to that voice because that voice is the true you actually telling you where to go. And when you follow through with that, what I have found, it's not always easy, but what I've found is you always end up in a better place.
That's so good, and that journey to all of that exposure is what I would call that. All of that exposure has led to fulfillment for yourself personally and what you're doing as well as what you do currently. And I think I can't I can't emphasize enough what you shared there about is you're not going to stop feeling that on the inside. You're not,
No,
it's never going to go away. And
no.
frankly, what it does, it turns into this it's almost like a competition, a war going on, which is what causes you to feel bad, is because you're in disagreement, disalignment with who you are supposed to be and where you're supposed to go. And you
Right.
referenced it's just like a personal relationship. Once you do move on, 99.999 whatever percent of the time, you always look back and say, I should have moved on the minute I knew. Right. The minute I knew. And
Yeah.
this is coming from someone that's divorced. And I know that here was the point 7, 8 years before the point, if that makes sense. So I think
No,
that's so important.
it makes total sense. And I liken it to divorce too, because I went through a divorce and I stayed way too long and I knew. And I kept justifying it because I'm saying, well, it's for these reasons, for the kids, for this, right? And I just knew internally, I knew. And I let it go on and tried to do the honorable thing. And at the end, it didn't work out really well for me, anyways, because it was like, I had made all of this money because no, imagine if I took the $450,000 job, then I probably would have capped out somewhere around six, $700,000, which not bad even by today's standards. But I've made millions and millions and millions of dollars, in these other industries per year. And so I had a fairly neat nest egg put aside. But in the divorce, it was like, hey, listen, I'm out. I'm taking 70% of that with me and all of this, right? So if I hadn't waited so long, then I wouldn't have mounted that nest egg and it wouldn't have been at jeopardy, right? So I don't begrudge the money to the other person. It's the manner in what it took form. And I knew 10 years prior that I should have not been there, but I tried to do the honorable thing because inside, and this is where I think people get conflicted, is they have their values and then they have their real true self. And so we learn beliefs and values from our upbringing, right? So, my grandfather adored his wife. My father adored my mother. And trust me, my mother was a very difficult lady to live with at times. But my father was just like there. So I saw that role model, going up. They both men in my family on the upper level would have died instantly to protect their spouse. I was always the same way. And so that, even though it's a good value, didn't serve me when I internally knew that I needed to move. And so, you know, if people know they need to move, make the move. It's not as scary, like you said, 7, 8 years later, you look back and you go, well, how did I spend so much time, in doing these things? And we all do this as human beings. But it's self-imposed. That's what I'm trying to get across to the people who are listening to this. We self-impose these limitations on us. And it's really comes from a place of scarcity and fear. Because, I mean, you could take anybody in the media today. I mean, Elon Musk, right? Hate him, love him, whatever. That's fine. My my point being is he's been financially successful. Well, he came from South Africa, so I would argue there's less opportunities in South Africa for people than there are in the United States, right? So the point being is you always have these stories of people who have come through great tragedy and heavy, heavy, heavy stuff, and they pulled their life together and they're in great places, right? Not just financially, you know, but it's even personally. And so, there are people who have survived, I think what Viktor Frankl, the concentration camps and things like that, and so there's not a human being on this planet who hasn't struggled in some capacity. But when we struggle internally with our own self and we self impose our own limitations, that's going to create suffering. And, so stress is inevitable, challenge is inevitable, problems are inevitable. Suffering, it truly is optional. So if you're in a suffering place, understand that you're the one, most likely, not you, but the person who's creating that, is likely self imposing that limitation on themselves. And that's what gets people stuck. But here's the thing, there's a starting date and an ending date of our life. We really can't do much about the two dates that go on that tombstone. I mean, might be able to, like, with better health and better, habits, stretch the line a little bit on the outgoing. So we can't make it much longer, but we can make it super fat. We can make that line super fat. And that super fat is happiness, and things that you want to accomplish. So fear stops that, and limitations, self-imposed limitations, are what stop that. That's what I found, anyways.
Yeah, I think you said so much there, but the thing that really resonated, at least for me personally, and I know there's some people connecting with that, is the fact that even in your divorce, I probably had some of the same feelings, right? It wasn't money or stuff or things of that nature. Now, it was a reflection point, primarily because of the fact that you knew way
Yeah.
before. That's the part that stings the most, right? And it's no different when you're in a role or in a job with and you don't want to be there and it is time to get a divorce. It's time to sign the paperwork. And earlier in our conversation you said something, and again, I recommend you rewind and listen again. But you said that there's a point where, you have to understand that you're not bound. Nobody's tying you to your circumstance other than you. And when you mentioned that, I was like, yeah, corporate America is not a person. You do have the ability to make a choice, a different choice, right? You're not imprisoned to that role and you can make the choice. Now, the fear piece, now that might require some deep work to get over that hurdle, but you're not bound there. And that level of comfort only exists is because of the fear that you have in taking a chance and betting on yourself. Whether that's a career change, going to a different company, starting your own business, having a side hustle, whatever it may be, the only thing standing in the way is the fear and scarcity of I've got this and I want to hang on to it so tight. I'm afraid to let it go. Right.
Yeah, and there are, to give people a break, there are conditions, right? So, I remember speaking to a gal who lived in Europe who fled one of the countries in the Middle East, and she was actually a doctor there. And she left, and she was having a hard time in Europe because she couldn't really find quality work. She couldn't use her medical background there. And And she was fearful because she shamed her family in her eyes. And if she went back, she was fearful that she would have, strong reprisal, to a place where she was concerned for her own life. That's what she was saying. So there are parts in the world, and I'm not saying the Middle East is a bad place. I'm not saying that at all. I've never been. I know plenty of people from there. They're good people. But even in the United States, there are places, where people are stuck in certain situations, um, and their struggle is much larger than most people, right? And so we've got to take a self check of what reality is and ask the question, and what I'm feeling, is this truth, or is this just, one of these things that I'm making up and amplifying, that, well, if I leave this relationship in our case, or if I leave this business relationship, what's going to happen? Am I truly going to end up on the side of the road and, living in a sleeping bag in the middle of the winter? I mean, really get clear about what the bottom line is. And I'll tell people this story because I found this the most liberating, free thing in my life. And my wife now actually told me a similar story, just differently. Um, so once I had a house, a couple of businesses, um, and had all the bills of the home, had all the maintenance of the home, had all of the stress when I wasn't making the money. This was early on in my life. I bought my first home at 23, and I was, I worked hard and I made the money to get the down payment and all that stuff. And I thought buying the house was like, oh my gosh, I'm a homeowner at 23, like yoo-hoo. And in the middle of the night, I hear the fire alarms going off in the house, and I wake up out of bed and I look down the hall, and there's this waft of smoke coming down the hall, and it hits me right in the face, and it's pretty darn hot. I can tell you that. I could joke and say that's what burned my hair off, right? I mean, it's not, but I ended up not being able to make it out of the house, and I ended up getting backed into the bedroom, and I ended up literally kicking the window out and jumping out the window of the house. Well, the house burned to the ground. Right? So it turned out it started in the heating area of the house, and um, and I'm here lying on the ground watching this house burn down while now the
Mm,
fire department and everybody is showing up. And anyways, my brother lived nearby. And so they took me to the hospital for smoke inhalation. And I came back, and like, I got nowhere to go. I've got my vehicle is in one driveway in the yard, and my other vehicle that I use for one of my businesses was there. And I go sleep at my brother's for like 3 hours, and I come out, and every insurance, wannabe now is on me, right? And their interviews, all this crazy stuff, right? Anyways, I went back to my brother's house, and I realized I didn't even have a toothbrush. And something was the most freeing ever in my life was the moment I realized I had no toothbrush. I no longer had a house. I no longer had this or that. And I couldn't figure it out at the time. But what I realized is, the unfortunate thing of the house burning and me almost dying made my life get a lot more clear. It was like, this house really isn't that important to me anymore. What is important to me? Quality of life, right? So I ended up, clearing the house off the property, and then, selling the property, and another house was built on the property and all this. And I moved on. Well, long story short, it was one of the best things I ever did, because it allowed me to move on with my life where I was tethering myself to something. So, you know, the house was my condition, but I didn't even know it. So we all have conditions, whether or not, some of us have physical disabilities, some of us have whatever. We just want to take our strengths and build upon those. But internally, when you feel like your house burnt down and you're like freed from that process, if you leave your job and you feel the same way, or you leave a relationship and you feel the same way, even though you're scared, like I didn't know what I was going to do, I didn't even know where I was going to live. I figured I could hang out at my brother's for a few days, right? I didn't know what was going to go on. But if you're feeling that, it's actually telling you it's the right move, even though tragedy happened. And so that's what I've learned from my life is like pay attention to the signs. And when we can't control what we can't control, just throw it back to the universe. And I learned this from Oprah Winfrey when she was deciding when she was going to try to move from the job in Baltimore where she was a black lady getting a really good job at the time, and her and the father, I think, was saying, well, how are you crazy if you leave this job, and she's like, I have this feeling I need to go to Chicago. And she did, despite everybody saying you're crazy, you got this stable thing. Well, guess what? She's Oprah Winfrey today, right? So, who I completely revere. But she said, anytime she got into a situation in at that moment, she said, you know what? I don't know what the right answer is, but I'm throwing it back to the universe. It's yours, universe. Whatever happens, happens. I'm going to do it anyways. So you tell me what to do. And that's what told her to go to Chicago.
Yeah, and I love what you said there from a condition standpoint. Sometimes we create those conditions, like a house, for example, is such a good thing that will tether you to a situation or
Yeah.
circumstances, money, whatever it might be. That your kids' education, I've heard that as well, like certain
Yeah.
things that you want for them, but there are other ways to get those same results that you want in different scenarios. You've just got to be willing to think outside of the box. So I think that was phenomenal what you said there and shared. And I'd love for the audience to know a little bit more about what you do from a CEO sales standpoint, and share with them if they want to connect with you and learn some more about what you do at this point and stage in your career.
Yeah, so I help independent business professionals, sales teams, do predictable revenue. So we built a math-based, metrics-based, predictable model, which I've used in literally thousands of companies, helping them over time. And we teach people that model. So if they have they want to grow their revenue, they want to do it safely, they want to do it with predictability, we teach them that and we train them through that whole process, and then we help sales teams do the same thing. Occasionally we'll even build a commission sales team for companies. That's one thing I do. I have a SaaS software. It's called Vibitno, Vibitno, and that is an automated, proactive, meaningful, and relevant follow-up system because have challenges with follow-up, so I figured I'd solve that problem. And so those are the main things that we do. There are others, but those are the two main things that we do.
That's great. So you're helping people get to predictable revenue. So if you've got a side hustle or you're an entrepreneur and you're listening, Doug is probably somebody you want to slide in his DMs. Where can the people get in touch with you, Doug? What's the best way to connect with you?
So they can go to Doug at what is your plan. No, sorry, that was one of my other companies I had. The Doug at ceosalesstrategies.com. That's this one. We used to have a company called What is Your Plan, where we would teach people literally through the mind process of
Yeah.
shifting, right? And so that's my personal email. You can go to Doug Brown 123. That's my LinkedIn. You can literally call me at 832-549-4836. Uh, and can I give a gift away to your audience?
Absolutely. Absolutely, Doug. Let's go.
So, any of you are thinking like, oh, I want to go into business, or I'm in business, but I want to predictably grow my revenue, because that's the most important thing in business, right? Money out, money in equals
Yep.
something. You want that money in to be a lot higher than the money out. I put together a training. It's about 40, 35, 40 minutes. It's CEO sales strategies /2, the number X with a little dash and method. So it's the 2X method. We call it the 2X method.
Yep.
But make sure the dash is in between the 2X and the method.
Yep.
And I'll give you the link. And
Yeah.
if you want to place it in, but it's really good training, and it'll help wrap your brain around, how do I make a little more money or a heck of a lot more money predictably?
Absolutely. We're going to be sure to link that in the show notes descriptions for everyone to tag and go ahead and grab that. And you've got some incredible ways to reach out to Doug. And as we kind of conclude our conversation, I want you to leave the audience with your final 5 words that if they don't remember anything else, remember these 5 things from Doug today. What would your final 5 words be, Doug?
Final 5 words.
And let me
Uh,
say this, it could be
yeah.
4, it could be 6, but and it could
So,
be a statement or a phrase, a quote, whatever works
yeah.
for you.
So, always believe in yourself. That would be my 5 words, because the self-belief in ourselves is what propels us to the next level. There's no matter how successful you get, and I know
Mhm,
people who are billionaires, or people who have been a multimillionaire, or here's the thing: as you go through changes in life and you go through changes, there are always going to be people who are going to be happy for you and people who are not going to be happy for you. And if we listen to the people who are not going to be happy for us, and unfortunately, some of that is going to be your friends that you have today, right? That you got to always be believing in yourself, because if you don't believe in yourself, the masses will pull you down and they'll pull you back. And they're not intentionally trying to do that. But what they are doing is they're pulling you down because they're such in a fear state that they don't want you to leave that fear state, because if you leave that fear state, then they've got to really look at themselves, and they don't want to do that most of the time. So they'll talk you out of things that you are committed to in your life. And so that would be my final thing to leave the audience with.
that's incredible, Doug. Always believe in yourself. Thank you so much for sharing with our audience today. I appreciate you, Doug, and it has been an absolute pleasure to actually have this conversation. I learned so much, and it was such a thought-provoking conversation. I encourage everyone to rewind, play it back. There were so many gems in there that I believe that can help unlock someone's future for them. And you might be the Steve Jobs at Stanford conversation that they needed to hear. So we really appreciate you, Doug. Thanks so much.
Oh, thanks so much for having me here. I'm blessed and grateful I'm here.
Awesome. And until next time, I love you and we'll talk soon.